Trailer trash? I shouted, barely believing what just came out of her mouth. That's right, Karen sneered, spitting toward my shoes. People like you don't belong here. And yeah, she really did that right there, on my gravel driveway in front of her precious $3 million mansion. If you've ever met someone who thinks money gives them a license to treat humans like dirt, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories where karma comes in liquid form. Because what Karen didn't know, I work sanitation, and she was about to find out exactly what happens when you insult the wrong guy with a septic truck. Grab your popcorn, because this story's about to get filthy in all the right ways. The moment she spat at my boots, everything around me seemed to slow down. The warm Florida air thickened with that humid mix of salt and gasoline that hangs around expensive coastal neighborhoods. And somewhere in the distance, a sprinkler hissed like the world itself was trying to shush her. But Karen couldn't be silenced. Her voice cut through the stillness like an air horn, trembling with the kind of outrage only people who've never been told no in their lives can muster. I stood there, still holding my wrench, still smelling like diesel and sweat, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. 1 minute I was finishing a routine septic job next door, minding my own business, and the next this woman was standing in her designer heels, calling me names I hadn't heard since high school. Trailer trash, she said again, louder this time, as if she wanted to make sure the whole neighborhood heard it. The words hit harder than the spit did. For a few seconds, I didn't say anything. I just looked at her mansion rising behind her like a marble fortress, sunlight bouncing off the tinted windows, every inch of it polished and perfect. She had that look rich people get when they think their square footage is a moral achievement. Her hair was done up like she was on her way to a fundraiser. Her lipstick didn't dare smudge even in the heat, and yet here she was, screaming at a man covered in grease and mud for existing within 100 feet of her precious property. I'd seen entitled people before, but this was something different. This was personal for her, even though we'd never met. Maybe it was the truck, or the logo on my shirt, or the smell that comes with the job. To her, it all confirmed what she already believed. I was beneath her, and the universe had made a mistake by letting me breathe her air. The neighborhood had gone quiet. A couple of landscapers across the street froze mid-trim, pretending not to look, but everyone was looking. The scene was too strange to ignore. I could feel their curiosity pressing on me like heat. I tried to stay calm. I'd been in worse situations with angrier people and tighter spaces, and I'd learned that nothing diffuses chaos like silence. But when she took a step closer, pointing her manicured finger toward my chest, something inside me cracked. She accused me of leaking toxic waste into her yard, said my truck was an eyesore, and called my clients degenerates. She didn't care that I was standing on public property, that I was doing my job, or that her accusations made no sense. In her mind, I was contamination in human form. I looked at her and saw a woman who had never cleaned anything herself, who probably thought a mop was a decorative item. She lived in a place where the lawns looked like carpets and the mailboxes matched the shutters, a neighborhood that smelled like chlorine and control. Her mansion wasn't just a house, it was a statement, a monument to the belief that money could separate her from the rest of humanity. But I knew better. I'd been inside those marble palaces before. I'd seen the cracks beneath the surface, the mold that crept through the walls, the pipes that rotted no matter how rich the owner was. Sewage doesn't care about status. It finds its way through everything eventually. So I took a slow breath, wiped the spit off my boot with the edge of my glove, and smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not yet. More of a knowing one. The kind that says you've just declared war on the wrong person. I wanted to say something clever, something that would shut her down, but all that came out was the truth. You have no idea what you just started. She laughed, a sharp little bark that sounded rehearsed. Then she turned on her heel and strutted back toward her mansion, the click of her heels echoing across the pavement. I watched her go, her silk scarf catching the wind like a flag of arrogance, and felt the weight of something shift inside me. That moment, as ridiculous and humiliating as it was, would change everything. I didn't know it then, but her insult was just the spark. The fire that was coming would burn brighter than either of us could imagine, and it would start with the thing she despised most in the world, the smell of raw, unfiltered consequence. Everyone in Silver Ridge Estates knew who Karen was long before they ever met her. Her reputation carried faster than the morning paper, wrapped in whispers and half-laughed warnings. People said she could fine you before your coffee had cooled, that she had a mental catalogue of every mailbox, shrub, and roof tile within 3 miles. If you left your trash bin out 10 minutes past collection, she knew. If your Christmas lights didn't match the approved color palette, she knew. She was the kind of person who turned neighborhood pride into neighborhood surveillance, and she did it all behind the mask of community responsibility. Her mansion sat like a palace at the top of the hill, its spotless white stone gleaming through the Florida heat, surrounded by a fence that wasn't so much for security as it was for separating her from the rest of the world. I had been in plenty of neighborhoods like this before. They always looked perfect from a distance. Rows of identical driveways, fountains that burbled with artificial cheer, manicured lawns trimmed to regulation length. But when you got close enough, you could feel the tension humming beneath the surface like an overworked generator. Silver Ridge was no different. People smiled politely but never too long, waved at each other through car windows, and avoided confrontation like it was contagious. That was because of Karen. She was the self-appointed guardian of property values, the president of the HOA for 8 consecutive years, and the unofficial queen of passive-aggressive warfare. Her mansion was a shrine to that control. Every inch gleamed, from the imported tile on her porch to the stainless steel mailbox engraved with her last name in cursive gold. Even her rose bushes grew in exact symmetry, as if afraid to disappoint her. Her husband, a shadowy figure people only saw on the weekends, stayed out of sight most of the time, leaving her to rule uninterrupted. She loved hosting mandatory volunteer meetings in her sunroom, where she'd sip sparkling water and lecture her neighbors about the importance of maintaining the aesthetic integrity of the community. The phrase sounded fancy enough to make people nod, but everyone knew it was code for, follow my rules or face the consequences. I learned all this within a week of my run-in with her. The landscapers who worked nearby told stories about her shouting at them for using the wrong brand of fertilizer. Delivery drivers said she followed them with her phone out, taking photos of license plates. One guy swore she once tried to have a pizza delivery banned because it wasn't from a restaurant on her approved vendor list. Everyone feared her because she had mastered the art of ruining lives legally. She knew exactly how to weaponize complaint forms, bylaws, and local ordinances until even the most harmless mistake could cost you hundreds in fines. After she called me trailer trash, I became her new obsession. I saw her car parked near my job site twice that week. Once, she slowed down enough for me to catch her reflection in the window, staring with the same icy disapproval she'd had that morning. A few days later, one of my clients mentioned that a woman had called, pretending to conduct a neighborhood sanitation inspection. She'd asked questions about my business, my schedule, and whether I handled hazardous materials responsibly. That was her favorite word. Responsible. It made her sound like she cared about safety when in reality she cared only about control. It didn't take long before I realized what she was doing. She wasn't just angry at me. She was building a case. The kind she used to justify every act of harassment she ever committed. I started getting random inspections from city workers who said they'd received complaints about improper waste disposal. My work truck was ticketed twice for parking in front of a client's home, even though it was legally parked both times. Someone even filed a noise complaint during one of my routine pump-outs, claiming I was running industrial machinery outside of approved hours. Each event carried her scent, that faint mix of arrogance and expensive perfume. But the funny thing about people like Karen is that their perfection is always an illusion. While she was busy combing through other people's flaws, her own mistakes were piling up, like waste beneath polished tile. I noticed that her property had an unusually high level of water runoff near the street, which meant her septic system was either overcapacity or illegally connected. It wasn't a detail most people would notice, but I make my living noticing things that smell off. So I started paying attention. Her back lawn sloped toward a drainage ditch that led straight into the neighboring property. During heavy rain, the water that pooled there had an unmistakable scent. That's when I realized that all her power came from pretending she was above the mess. She lived in a world where image meant everything, where spotless marble and overpriced perfume could hide the rot beneath. But the truth is, no one escapes what's underneath forever. Every system, no matter how luxurious, has limits. Every pipe has pressure. Every secret leaks, eventually. And Karen, for all her rules and her status, was living above a tank that was seconds from bursting. I didn't know it yet, but the day she spit on my boots, she wasn't just insulting me. She was daring me to pull the plug on her perfect little kingdom. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, one of those cloudless Florida days when the air feels too heavy to breathe. I was in my truck, halfway through a routine maintenance job at a retirement community. When my phone buzzed with an address I recognized instantly. 14 Birchwood Lane. Karen's mansion. The name alone was enough to make my pulse jump. For a split second, I thought it might be a prank, but the voice on the other end was formal, clipped, and desperate in the way that only comes from rich people dealing with unpleasant realities. "We have an emergency," the woman said. "Our system is backing up. The smell is unbearable. We need immediate assistance." She didn't give her name, but she didn't have to. That tone of entitlement was unmistakable. I drove over slowly, partly because I wanted to savor the irony, and partly because I didn't trust whatever mess I was walking into. The closer I got, the quieter the neighborhood seemed, as if the entire street was holding its breath. When I pulled into her driveway, the first thing I noticed was the stench. It was faint but unmistakable, that sour blend of methane and negligence that clings to the air like guilt. I stepped out of the truck and found Karen standing in the middle of her yard in silk pajamas and oversized sunglasses, arms crossed, tapping her foot like she'd been waiting for me all day. "You're late," she said before I could even greet her. Her voice was tight with frustration. Her face flushed from the heat or maybe the humiliation of needing help from someone she thought she'd humiliated. I glanced at my watch and then at her pipes, already knowing what kind of disaster I was about to find. "You called 20 minutes ago," I said, keeping my tone as polite as I could. "That's not late." She didn't respond. Instead, she gestured toward the backyard like a queen ordering a servant to handle the dirty work. "Just fix it," she muttered. Her backyard was a monument to excess, a marble patio stretched toward an infinity pool that shimmered in the sunlight, surrounded by palm trees that looked imported straight from a resort brochure. But it all smelled wrong. The sweet rot of decomposing waste clung to every breeze, and I could see patches of wet grass near the far end of the yard, where the soil looked darker than it should have. I knelt down, opened a maintenance hatch, and immediately saw the problem. Her septic lift system, an elaborate custom setup designed to push wastewater uphill to the main line, had been neglected for years. Filters clogged, sensors corroded, safety valves sealed shut with calcium buildup. Whoever installed it had done a fine job, but maintenance clearly wasn't part of her vocabulary. When I told her what was happening, she looked genuinely offended, as though physics itself had betrayed her. "That's impossible," she said. "This system cost me more than your truck." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Money doesn't buy immunity from bad plumbing. I explained that her system was overpressurized and that the overflow lines were draining directly into the ditch behind her neighbor's house. That was the kind of violation that could shut down a property, maybe even result in fines if the county caught wind of it. Her eyes flickered for just a second, enough for me to see the panic underneath her polished exterior. Then she straightened up, lifted her chin, and said, "Just make it stop." While she retreated inside to avoid the smell, I took my time documenting everything. Photos of the illegal drainage line, video of the overflow pump cycling at double pressure, screenshots of the septic data from the control unit that showed years of ignored maintenance alerts. Every detail painted the same picture. Negligence disguised as luxury. I didn't plan on using it yet, but experience had taught me that people like Karen never learned until you showed them what the truth smelled like. As I worked, a storm started building on the horizon, the kind that comes out of nowhere in the late afternoon and floods the air with static. I could hear distant thunder rolling across the sky, and with it came the faint gurgle of pressure building in her pipes. The system was on the verge of bursting, a swollen stomach of arrogance and waste waiting for the smallest trigger. I adjusted a few valves, calibrated the pressure gauge, and realized just how close her pristine home was to becoming a disaster zone. One wrong move, one careless command, and the entire system would release everything it had been holding back. When I finished, I found Karen standing by the glass doors with her arms folded. "Well?" she asked, as if expecting me to thank her for the privilege of cleaning up her mistake. I told her the truth. The system needed a full replacement, not a patch job. It was unsafe, out of code, and illegal in 3 separate ways. She waved a hand dismissively and told me to send her a quote, already walking away. But I could tell by the stiffness in her shoulders that she didn't like losing control. And as I packed up my tools, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the marble like a countdown. She thought the problem was fixed. I knew it was only beginning. By the time the storm rolled in that evening, the air around Silver Ridge Estates felt different. The kind of heavy stillness that makes even the birds go quiet settled over the streets. I was sitting in my truck outside a small diner, staring at my coffee and thinking about the job I had just finished at Karen's mansion. Part of me wanted to forget the whole thing, to wash off the smell of sewage and the sting of her words and move on. But the other part, the quieter, steadier part that had been collecting small slights and insults my entire life, wouldn't let it go. Her face kept flashing in my mind, the tilt of her chin, the contempt curling her lips as she told me to, just fix it. I'd spent years cleaning up other people's messes, people who thought laborers like me were disposable. But Karen had taken it to another level. She didn't just look down on me. She needed me to stay down there. The rain started to fall in fat, slow drops that darkened the pavement, and with every minute it fell harder. I thought about the pressure inside her septic system, the illegal drainage lines, the corroded valves. It was a miracle the thing hadn't exploded already. When I left her property earlier that afternoon, the system had been one thunderclap away from failing. I had given her the warning, and she had laughed. She'd actually laughed, standing there in her silk robe, telling me that people in her position didn't have plumbing problems. That line replayed in my head until it stopped being funny. By midnight, the storm had turned vicious. Lightning flashed across the sky in white sheets, illuminating the wet rooftops and the empty streets. I couldn't sleep, so I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The roads were slick, the gutters overflowing, the air thick with that metallic smell that always comes before something breaks. When I turned the corner onto Birchwood Lane, I saw it immediately, the lights from Karen's mansion still on, a soft golden glow spilling through the rain like arrogance refusing to dim. My truck idled at the edge of her driveway while I watched the water pooling around her yard. The runoff from her property had nowhere to go. It was building, inch by inch, pressing against the sealed valves of her neglected septic system. Nature and negligence had finally decided to team up. I didn't touch anything at first. I just watched. The pump hummed weakly from the utility shed, straining against the flood. Then came the sound, a deep, muffled gurgle, like a beast waking from sleep. The ground trembled underfoot. A few seconds later, the first fountain erupted. Brown, bubbling water shot straight from the flower bed beside her walkway, splattering across her white marble steps. Another burst followed near the pool, then another by the driveway. Within moments, her perfect yard was transformed into a churning sea of filth. The smell hit next, sharp and sour, the kind that sticks to the back of your throat. Karen appeared on her balcony, clutching a phone in one hand and a towel in the other, her voice rising above the storm as she shouted for help. The sight was surreal. The woman who treated everyone like servants now stood helpless in a silk nightgown, her perfect hair plastered to her face, watching her empire drown. I could hear her through the rain, screaming into the phone, demanding that someone fix it, but no one could. Once a system like that gives out, there's no stopping it. The pipes beneath her home belched and roared, pushing everything she'd buried back to the surface. Every insult, every ounce of contempt, every piece of hidden rot came bubbling up in the most literal way imaginable. The neighbors started coming out with umbrellas, their faces lit by the flashing lights of their phones as they recorded the chaos. Someone must have called the news because a van arrived not long after, headlights cutting through the rain as reporters climbed out. Karen tried to block the cameras, shouting that it was a private matter, but the image of her standing knee-deep in what used to be her pride and joy was too good to ignore. Her pool overflowed with sewage, her lawn looked like a swamp, and the smell was so thick that even the reporters kept their distance. I stayed parked across the street, watching through the rain-smeared windshield. I didn't feel proud exactly. There wasn't joy in seeing someone's life fall apart, not even someone who'd earned it. What I felt was something quieter, steadier justice maybe. Not the kind written in law books, but the kind that arrives when the world decides to balance its own scales. When I finally drove away, the storm was starting to fade, but her mansion still glowed behind me, lit from within like a sinking ship that refused to admit it was going under. I rolled down my window for one last look and caught a final glimpse of her in the floodlight, shouting orders at no one, her voice lost to the wind and the smell of her own undoing. By sunrise, the street looked like a crime scene, wrapped in yellow tape and shame. The news vans were still there, their tires sunk into muddy tracks along the curb, cameras pointing toward the hill where Karen's mansion sat in ruin. The storm had passed hours earlier, leaving behind a silence that didn't feel peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes after a scream, where everything seems too still, as if the world itself is holding its breath, waiting to see what's left standing. The marble walls of her house gleamed faintly in the weak morning light, but they couldn't hide the mess. Mud, water, and sewage had mixed into a thick brown paste that clung to everything: her lawn, her driveway, even the base of her white pillars. The smell still lingered in the air, heavy and sour, hanging over the neighborhood like a reminder that money can't buy purity when the pipes underneath are rotten. I parked my truck at the edge of the cul-de-sac and watched the parade begin. City inspectors in reflective vests trudged up her driveway with clipboards and masks, whispering to each other while they took photographs. Neighbors who once worshipped her authority now stood in clusters, shaking their heads, some hiding smiles behind their hands. A few even waved when they saw me, the first friendly gestures I'd ever gotten from anyone on that street. For years, Karen had ruled them through fear of embarrassment, but now she was the embarrassment. Everything she had built her power on, her spotless home, her influence, her image of perfection, was drowning in the kind of filth she'd always pretended didn't exist. When she finally emerged, she didn't look like the woman I'd met that first day. The sharp edges were gone, the arrogance washed away. Her hair was tangled, her face pale and drawn, her silk robe replaced by old sweatpants and a t-shirt that probably hadn't seen daylight in years. She kept her eyes low, stepping around puddles that no longer mattered. 2 men from the county handed her a stack of papers, and she stood there, barefoot and silent, while they explained violations, fines, and the possibility of condemnation. Her neighbors pretended to be concerned, but I could see the satisfaction in their faces. They had waited a long time to watch the Queen lose her crown. The news cameras didn't miss a thing. The reporters circled like vultures, narrating her downfall in calm, professional tones, describing how years of ignored maintenance and illegal drainage had caused the failure. One even mentioned how she'd called the same company she'd harassed earlier in the week, the blue-collar worker she'd publicly insulted, to fix her system before it failed. I didn't need them to say my name. Everyone knew. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, that the woman who had once bragged about her impeccable property standards was now front-page news for turning her own mansion into a public health hazard. Later that day, I got a call from a county official asking if I'd be willing to provide a professional statement. I told him the truth. The system had been neglected, illegally modified, and dangerously overpressurized. There was no sabotage, no mystery, no malice, just cause and effect. He thanked me, his tone careful, maybe even impressed. When I hung up, I realized that was the first time in weeks I'd felt truly clean, despite the fact that I still smelled faintly of diesel and disinfectant. In the following days, things changed fast. The HOA board held an emergency meeting, one that Karen was no longer invited to lead. Her resignation was announced by email, a short message filled with hollow phrases about personal challenges and temporary leave. But everyone knew the truth. She was finished. Her house was sealed for environmental remediation, her reputation dissolved like bleach on marble, and her power evaporated with it. People started waving at me when I drove through the neighborhood for jobs. Some even apologized for staying quiet when she'd gone after me. I didn't hold it against them. Fear can make good people small. The last time I saw Karen was about a week later. She was standing on her front steps, a realtor's sign planted in the mud beside her. She didn't look up when my truck passed, didn't shout or sneer, or even acknowledge me, just stared into the distance like someone trying to wake up from a bad dream. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the way she'd looked at me that first day, how she'd spit on my boots and called me less than human. You can't pity someone who built their life on looking down at everyone else. As I drove away, The sunlight hit the broken reflection of her house in the puddles, and I thought about how quickly things change. One word, one insult, one cruel moment can ripple outward until the whole foundation cracks. Karma doesn't always come fast, but it always finds the right address, and when it does, it doesn't knock, it floods the gates and washes everything clean. And that, folks, is how a spit turned into a flood. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: never underestimate someone who works with pressure systems for a living, emotional, or hydraulic. Karen called me trailer trash, but when the dust and the sludge settled, she was the one swimming in her own arrogance. So yeah, maybe the universe has a sense of humor after all. Hit that subscribe button if you think karma should always arrive with interest. Drop your wildest neighbor story in the comments, I read every one. And remember, stay humble, stay kind, and never pick a fight with the guy holding the hose.